Another day, another move from U.S. President Donald Trump that antagonizes his trading partners. This time, he targeted the global steel and aluminum industries. Trump announced that the U.S. plans to impose 25% tariffs on steel imports and 10% on aluminum. A formal order is expected to be signed next week. This comes after some confusion earlier this morning on whether or not an announcement was actually coming. Trump held a last-minute listening session with industry executives. This is one of Trump's toughest trade moves to date. It's uncertain if Canada is exempted from these tariffs, but it could leave us in a tough spot. Last year, the U.S. imported 29 million tons of steel, 4 million of that from Canada, or about 16%. Turns out we're the #1 supplier of steel to the U.S., despite China being the world's biggest producer of steel and aluminum. It's hard to overstate the importance of a commodity like steel. It's used in so many things that the commodity itself is sometimes considered something of a barometer. Stock markets plunged today when these tariffs were announced, in part because investors worry about an impact on consumer spending, but also that this may set off a larger trade war with retaliations and escalations. But here's where things get really weird. Trump sounds like he's angry with China, the world's largest steel producer, but China actually sells very little steel to the U.S. And as I just said, Canada sells more steel to the U.S. than anyone. To help us talk about this latest tariff move and other trade tension, we're joined by trade lawyer Mark Warner. He's principal at Maw Law. Thank goodness you're here, because there's a lot of questions I have here. And first and foremost, I think, is who is this aimed at?
Well, I think it's aimed largely at his voters and his base. He made a lot of promises in the last election about trade. He hasn't been able to deliver on much in the first year of his administration. He has ramped up some trade remedy stuff that we've seen in Canada, but most of that was hangover from the Obama administration. So I think this is a first attempt to make something concrete. Obviously, the big target, I think, is China. Although what's odd in the case of both steel and aluminum, China is not really the major source of imports into the United States. It's a small part of it, and it's already subject to a lot of existing trade remedy laws. Right. So that's the odd part. But I think in terms of the big picture of getting jobs back into the U.S. and being seen to be active on trade, targets, that's why he's gone after steel and aluminum.
But let's dig in on that, because it is kind of weird. It's kind of weird for people who follow trade. Imagine somebody who hasn't followed it saying, wait a second, you're targeting China. China barely sells any steel to the United States at all. What China does is it floods global markets because it has an overabundance of steel at home. So it floods global markets, that depresses prices, brings prices down, and that in turn affects prices in the United States. And that's what angers the Trump administration, and specifically Trump himself, his trade counsel, Peter Navarro specifically. Do the trade measures announced today, these tariffs, do they have any impact on that particular grievance?
Not directly, probably not. In a sense that what it will do in the immediate term is to raise prices for American producers at home, just because the fact is that the tariffs will be applied. So it has that kind of an effect. It also is a signaling effect, I think, in terms of China, that the administration is getting serious about this stuff and that they want the Chinese to deal with the overcapacity problems. And it's also a message to the rest of the world, from his perspective, I think, which is, okay, other countries in the world, you've got to use your trade remedy laws to go after those imports, those Chinese imports to exports into Canada, for instance. And also, he would argue, I guess, and he, I think, mentioned this in his scrum after his conference with the steel execs, he said, we're also concerned with circumvention, that countries can export into Canada, Mexico, other countries like that, and export into the United States. So I think this is his way of saying, I actually want a solution to Chinese overcapacity, and I want my allies to actually be on my side.
Do something about it. I mean, that's a complex problem. And then the sort of flip side of this whole debate is, this will definitely help U.S. steel producers. Do they need that help?
Well, they would argue that they do, obviously. I mean,
didn't they just post like their greatest quarterly earnings in the history of the steel industry?
But they're also seeing a rush of imports into the United States. That's the basis of this, and the loss of jobs. So, I mean, does anybody really need trade action? I mean, you've got an American president who's a protectionist, who ran under it, and you have a sympathetic ear and you go for it. And I think that's what they've done.
If this goes ahead, I've been just trying to read up on what will the impact be. We've seen ExxonMobil say that they're going to have to reconsider the biggest expansion expansion of a refinery in U.S. history. Molson Coors saying this will bring up the price of beer because the aluminum they use to make beer cans. You know,
automakers as well.
Automakers are looking at it. Malls and condo towers. Is there anybody aside from the American consumer themselves that's really going to feel this?
Well, I mean, the American consumers are going to feel it. Some of our producers will feel it to some extent if it affects our exports into the United States to some extent. We'll see it on the price of cars because you know, cars are an integrated product across the market. So people will feel this. I think that I want to say, stepping back from it, I'm not sure that it's done yet. I'm always careful with Trump. Let's read the fine print. So he made an offhand comment, you know, at the end of a meeting with executives. His spokesperson didn't actually brief it.
This is when he said, I don't think any country should get an exemption because then everybody wants an exemption.
And let's just wait and see, because in the recommendation that came from Commerce, the recommendation in that package, the unions, the steelworkers unions and the executives had said, don't include Canada. The defense secretary said, exempt our key allies. And so let's see what the fine print is. There was also some talk in the recommendations of having a process for particular exemptions. So with Trump, I always want to read the fine print. We're doing what he wants us to do. We're getting excited at the announcement.
When? Next week?
I think sometime next week, maybe a little bit after that. They're going to have to cross the T's and dot the I's because everybody knows it's going to be a trade action. This really hasn't been used, this particular procedure.
This is like a national security measure.
Right. So Nixon, there's a lot of similarities to Nixon. Nixon was the last, or Ford perhaps a little bit, but that area, that Watergate era was the last time it was used. So maybe he likes to, you know, copy Nixon in more than one way.
And then we'll get into what happens and whatever Canada will actually do in terms of they say they'll do responsive measures, and we'll bring you back in to talk about that.
All right. Thank you.
Great to see you, Mark. Thanks for this. Trade lawyer Mark Warner, principal at Maw Law.